Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts. I wanted to talk particularly to Australians, if I could. I wanted to talk about the wars that we're engaging in that are led by the US empire, and how war just seems to be normalized these days. We just seem, the Australian government just seems to follow along in whatever war the US empire wants us to join, basically. And of course, there's obviously pressure to do that too. The US empire sort of likes to put pressure on any, particularly Western allies, mostly using sticks rather than carrots, to get Western allies to join their wars, which are for hegemony and resources. That's really what most of, well, I'd say all of the US, all their wars actually are for hegemony and resources. And yesterday I interviewed a woman, her name's Dr. Dalia Wasfi, and her father and mother, her mother is Jewish and her father's an Iraqi Muslim. And Dalia went to Iraq in 2002 and, sorry, it was 2004 and 2006. No, I'm not a journalist. Somebody's asking me, am I a journalist? No. No, I'm just a concerned citizen, a concerned Australian citizen. And so she went to Iraq in 2004 and 2006 after the shock and awe invasion in Iraq. And I just want to share with you some of the things that she's said about the experience she had, and she has relatives there. She said that, well, first of all, the recent 16th, I think, anniversary of 9/11 happened. So she said, never forget the millions of Afghans, Iraqis, and Americans who had zero to do with the events of September 11th, 2001, but whose lives were destroyed for empire. And before I go on and talk about Dalia's experience in her with her trip to Iraq, and also I'm going to describe some things that some Iraqi veterans have said about what they've been doing there. I just wanted to remind people that the Saudi Arabian government has been implicated in 9/11, and this is not sort of conspiracy stuff. They actually have. They even financed a dry run of 9/11. So just remember that when we think about the U.S. empire and their closest ally, which is Saudi Arabia. They give lots of funding to Saudi Arabia, and yet Saudi Arabia is incredible for human rights abuses. I mean, they behead people in public. They've beheaded, like hundreds of people in public, in the last couple of years, and women can't drive, and there's slavery there. Human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia are extreme, and yet the U.S. is completely fine with that. They're not fine with some other countries that might have some human rights abuses. They're totally fine with probably one of the biggest human rights abusers around. But anyway, that's besides the point. But I'm going to get back to Dalia Wasfi, who went to Iraq. And I wanted to sort of just firstly say, she said, shortages, lack of electricity, portable water, tanks rolling through the streets night and day, gunfire and explosions, Iraqi healthcare in shambles, 200 bodies turn up daily in Baghdad morgues. For Iraqis, it's 9/11 every day. So, and she said, picture this in your mind. A humanitarian worker in Baghdad is quoted as recalling the scene after a bomb blast. Quote, I saw a 4-year-old boy sitting beside his mother's body, which had been decapitated by the explosion. He was talking to her, asking her what had happened." End quote. Now just imagine that in our country. Just imagine if you're in Australia and, if you live in Australia and that's one of the things that's happening. You've got some other country bombing you night and day. And I'm going to get to what the Iraqi veterans, war veterans, have said about what they do there. Now, this is a war that Australia is participating in. This is a war, one of many wars that Australia is participating in and going along with US empire. After you've heard some of the descriptions of what, US soldiers have been doing there, it's really immoral. I mean, war is a moral period, but these wars are, there's no doubt, it's all out in the open that this war, they manufactured, the mainstream media, manufactured consent so that the US could go in and invade Iraq. And there was no weapons of mass destruction. It was one of those it was a false flag, like a Gulf of Tonkin sort of thing in Vietnam. Excuse me. So, everybody went in there on false pretenses, and it was for oil and for hegemony in that region. And it's been like that ever since. And they created a hole for the likes of ISIS. Even President Obama, has said that the Iraq invasion and that what took place there created a vacuum to which ISIS arose. So, the US are responsible for ISIS arising, and now they're using that. They're using ISIS as an excuse to go from one country to another, to another, to another. Now, anybody that thinks at this point that the US invades countries for humanitarian reasons is grossly mistaken. So, you have to remember that the US doesn't go into to any country for humanitarian reasons. They go in for their own reasons, and they are usually corporate reasons, because most of Congress, well, I'd probably say almost all of Congress, and there's 535 members, they may as well be wearing little brand names on their jackets, like Raytheon and Northrop and Exxon, etc. All these corporations that that are behind what's going on in in these countries. So this is something we need to remember. And so now I want to talk to you about what happened in the 90s when the US applied sanctions to Iraq. Now this was to disable Iraqis to the point where they were very weakened and could not resist what was coming. And the sanctions, I'll just read a quote about the sanctions. During the first Gulf War, destruction of Iraq's electrical grids incapacitated the medical system. What had been a first-class range of facilities known as the jewel of the Arab world. After January 1991, primary health care and preventative services ceased to exist, and with economic sanctions, there were critical shortages of food and life-saving drugs and equipment. Cholera became endemic in Iraq. Easily treatable diseases such as respiratory infections and diarrhea accounted for 70% of the deaths of children under 5 years old. And there was, Madeleine Albright was asked, there was about 500,000 children died during those sanctions, probably even more, but 500,000 that we know of. And she was asked, was that worth it? And she said, yes, it's worth it. Well, that is an extremely racist and supremacist thing to say about anybody, about any country. If you've got a mass sort of killings of children through sanctions, and to say, oh, that was worth it, really. Can you imagine? I'd like us to imagine this happening in our own country. Can you imagine, for example, these mostly Muslim majority countries have drones, flying overhead and assassinating people from the sky, without trial, just because they're suspected to be a terrorist or an insurgent. An insurgent, I imagine there'd be a lot of insurgents in Australia if we had drones flying overhead and assassinating our friends and family, or blowing up our houses. I think we would definitely become insurgents. So, these words that the US uses to demonize people who are resisting their country's occupation and destruction, it's part of the propaganda that's put out by the US, so that they can occupy and do whatever they want in those countries. So and I didn't read the last part of that quote. This calamity was the tragic state of Iraqi society when the illegal shock and awe invasion came, and with it a vastly increased number of patients. So I asked her, I found out some other things, basically, where at that when shock and awe happened in 2003. This information's about 11 years old, but around 2006, due to the desperate conditions in Iraq of no security, high crime and targeted assassinations occurred. It was estimated that 18,000 of Iraq's 34,000 physicians had fled the country. 2,000 doctors and 164 nurses had been murdered, and another 250 kidnapped for high-priced ransoms. Can you imagine that? 68% of Iraqis lack access to safe drinking water. 81% are without proper sewerage. Women have all but disappeared from their roles in the workforce, once contributors to Iraqi society as teachers, judges, lawyers, doctors, engineers, traffic police, and more. The threat of violence and kidnapping now imprisons many women in their homes. But even there, they are not safe from the terrorism of Delhi house raids by American soldiers and their subordinate Iraqi police. So, so much for women's rights since the invasion. And by the way, sectarianism virtually didn't exist before shock and awe, before 2003. So that's another thing that people don't realize. So I'm going to talk a little bit about depleted uranium, because this is something that the Americans use regularly in any of their invasions. Depleted uranium, an Iraqi war veteran, Mark Howard, said that there's no reason for the US to use depleted uranium, except that it is free. They could use tungsten if they wanted to, except that he said there are no tanks. They use depleted uranium because it's free, and it was left over from the Cold War, and it's free. And but tungsten would actually, it's supposed to be heavier than lead, and it would pierce armor and tanks. Well, the thing is, there are no tanks for them to be, sort of wanting to use this on. So they don't even have to use depleted uranium, but they do it anyway. So He said that depleted uranium is the Agent Orange of this war. The US military uses Iraq as a dumping ground to get rid of their nuclear waste. That's what US Iraqi war veteran Mark Howard said. And if you search for Mark Howard, US veteran, and Iraq on YouTube, you can see probably the whole video of him talking about what they did. And I'll probably share a couple of his experiences after I talk about depleted uranium. So depleted uranium is a radioactive byproduct from the industrial process used to enrich uranium. The Pentagon likes to claim that American forces and Iraqis are not at risk from contact with the depleted uranium, which is used in armor-piercing munitions and protective tank plating. But that's completely untrue. Scientists claim that the inhalation may cause lung cancer, kidney damage, various bone cancers and skin cancers, as well as birth defects and chemical poisoning. Depleted uranium particles are soluble in water, and depleted uranium maintains radioactivity for billions of years and can concentrate in the food chain. Depleted uranium was also used in the US invasion of Iraq in 1991. So, radioactive dust is soluble and gets into the water supply. It vaporizes when it hits things. So basically, it vaporizes everywhere and goes everywhere. And there's been incredible birth defects and all sorts of cancers have arisen in Iraq. Now, can you imagine if we had this going on here in Australia, or if you live in the US or wherever, where you have an army that's invaded your country, they're droning your friends and family from the sky with Hellfire missiles that decapitate people and blow them to smithereens. If you've ever seen a Hellfire missile and what it does to cars, etc., and buildings, it just absolutely levels them, and just like there's incinerated. Cars are incinerated. So you can imagine what that does to people. And since this shock and awe invasion, there's been devastating consequences to the seed commons. Iraq had an incredible seed bank, and it's pretty much been destroyed. Monsanto is somewhere in there as well. The post-invasion destruction of the seed common has been outrageous. This Iraq war is called the forgotten occupation. And you don't really hear about it because the US is too busy saber-rattling towards North Korea, towards China, towards Russia, towards Venezuela. It's basically saber-rattling toward any country, any country that won't submit and buckle under to the US. Have you noticed that? Any country that doesn't want to do the US's bidding is usually vilified by the mainstream media, the corporate media, and then the next thing you know, and I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. This has been going on for a long, long time, decades. It's been going on for a long time, and this is not just if you look at how the US was founded. It was founded through the American Revolution. And during the American Revolution, it was actually a counter-revolution. If you look up Professor Gerald Horne and look up the Empire Files, you find out that the British, the English were trying to scale back slavery and also stop the founding fathers and the settlers from taking indigenous native land. And George Washington and John Hancock and John Adams and all these different founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, etc., they didn't want slavery to end. That's the first thing. And George Washington was actually a real estate person, and he was wanting to take more indigenous native land. So, they didn't want slavery to end. The American Revolution was actually a counter-revolution fighting the British they didn't want slavery to end, and they didn't want to stop taking indigenous native land. So the whole of the US is founded on a sort of a white supremacist position, and it's basically traveled through that with that white supremacist position for a long time. Of course, all of us, if you're a white person, we all have white privilege and we all benefit from this white supremacist position. And I wonder if a lot of Western countries, the citizens of Western countries, there's an inherent sort of whether it may not be overt, but there's an inherent racism there. If we are not bringing up the fact that our country is participating in the bombing and killing of millions of brown people overseas. If we don't have a problem with that, then there's something wrong. We need to ask ourselves why. Why do we not have a problem with that? We can get really upset when somebody does something in Paris, like Charlie Hebdo. We can get really upset if something happens in London, like a tube station thing, or something happens in Germany. But when just recently there's been lots of terrible carnage in Iraq, civilian carnage, and carnage in Syria, and these other Muslim majority countries. And where are the flags on the Eiffel Tower then? You know what I'm saying? So, this is the thing. We are involved in a white supremacist imperialist ongoing normalization of war against and killing of millions of brown people overseas for resources and hegemony. We may not be goose-stepping into these countries, but it's very Hitler-esque what's going on now. There are 8 countries, or possibly more, that we are involved in, mostly Muslim-majority countries. Pakistan is being droned, and there's operations going on there. And Yemen, I invite you to look up what's happening in Yemen. And I'm going to, if you look on I have a site, it's called The Naked Empire, and I don't have an actual YouTube URL yet because it's only just started, so I don't have an easily recognizable URL. But if you have a look in my feed, you'll see that I've recently posted something from The Naked Empire. That I focus on anti-imperialism and anti-war. So anyway, I just want to continue on with this, what we're talking about here about Iraq, because that is the forgotten thing. But what I wanted to say about Yemen is there is an ongoing genocide happening in Yemen. The U.S. is backing Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen, which is the poorest country in the Middle East, bombing their citizens, and basically bombing all their medical infrastructure and anything that they could possibly turn to. And now there is one child every 10 minutes dying of starvation and disease. One child every 10 minutes. Do you hear that in the mainstream media? Do you hear it in the Murdoch-owned media in Australia? Do you hear it anywhere? It's a US-backed Saudi invasion of Yemen, and now there are hundreds of thousands of people stricken with cholera. This is in Yemen. Now, if we don't care about that in Australia, why do we not care about it? We have to ask ourselves, why? Why do we not care what is going on in Yemen? Why is the corporate-owned media, why is the Murdoch media in Australia completely silent about that? And, it's sort of like, it's appalling. One child every 10 minutes dying of famine and disease, and our ally, the US, is backing Saudi Arabia, its ally, in destroying Yemen. And basically, it's an ongoing genocide. Do you hear about it anywhere? That's appalling. this is the sort of world we're living in now. Australia has no leaders with vision. I've rung up different politicians in Australia asking about these wars. I rang up one of the Labor politicians. I live in Tasmania, and she basically said that, she didn't. I said, why are we not speaking out about this ongoing genocide in Yemen? She said, oh, we're, quote, monitoring it. How do you monitor a genocide? The Australian government, the politicians here are so morally weak, they cannot stand up to this terrorist empire, which is what the US is. Let's call it what it is. Let's stop believing what the mainstream media says about what the US is doing, because it's just propaganda at this point. It really is. And start getting our news from independent news sources. And I can suggest one in particular, the Empire Files, with Abby Martin and Michael Preisner. You can find it at theempirefiles.tv, or you can just find it at Abby Martin, ABBY Martin, MARTIN, on Twitter. Just go to @Abby Martin on Twitter, and she posts all the programs, and it's a fantastic program to find out what's going on. And also, you can find out some information from the Real News Network, and I'll put these down. I'll put some of these down in some tweets so people can check them out. There's different ones that we can follow. If you want to follow what's happening in Syria, follow the independent journalist Ava Bartlett. She's an on-the-ground independent reporter in Syria. And that's more propaganda coming about Syria too. It really is. That's another story. And I hope to do an interview with her someday. She's very, very busy. But, and this is the other thing. I did an interview with John Preisner from the Answer Coalition. And John Preisner has recently gone to DPRK, to North Korea. And what he's reported there, and this is, he went there, and it wasn't a supervised tour. He went all around with some friends around North Korea, and it's completely different to what is presented in the mainstream media. They have, it's incredibly clean, the infrastructure is amazing. They have free education, free health care. He said he went all over the place. It would have been impossible. It would have been bigger than Ben-Hur to coordinate some sort of a false example of what is in North Korea. Now, I'm not saying that the government is not problematic in some way, but let's remember something about North Korea, something that lots of people don't realize. In the early 50s, North Korea was basically bombed a fifth of their population was killed by in a U.S. invasion, basically. And there was some atrocities committed there that I've done an interview with John Preisner, and unbelievable atrocities, like they put children in a building with their mothers, and they left them there for a week. There was about 100 children and many adults. And they left them there. It was called the Sinchon Massacre. Look it up, Sinchon Massacre. They put them in this building and they left them there for a week in the freezing cold without any food. And then after a week, they tipped gasoline down into the building and set it on fire. This is what the US, this is a sort of crimes, war crimes, and war is a crime in general, but these are the sort of particular atrocities. And don't forget, the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they didn't have to. At the time, they didn't have to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they did. So they murdered hundreds of thousands of Japanese people, maimed them, and it was an appalling death. These are just civilians. If you look into the history of the United States and what their wars were really about, with the assistance, of course, of the CIA, which is their main way of doing regime change. If you look at how many governments they've overthrown in the last, 7 or 8 decades, it's been about 81. 81 governments they've interfered with, and countries they've interfered with. And if you're Australian, the CIA has admitted that they interfered with the Australian government when they thought that Gough Whitlam in 1975 was going to close Pine Gap. And mind you, Pine Gap is used as a way of coordinating drone strikes in the Middle East. So our country is being used in these targeted assassinations from the sky, where we send Hellfire missiles that blow up civilians, funeral processions and wedding parties. Our Pine Gap is being used for that sort of thing. So at the time, 1975, the CIA has admitted since then that they actually assisted in the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. So the US empire has also done a sort of a regime change, or if you can call it that, has meddled in our government and has gotten rid of who was had very strong socialist leanings, which would have been really good for the country, was really great with indigenous rights, and would have been a great thing for the country, Gough Whitlam. So they got rid of him because that interfered in US interests, one being Pine Gap, and two, that they had corporate interests, and they wanted to, and that was the beginnings of when neoliberalism basically came into Australia and has been destroying things since then. Excuse me. That's the market. When the marketplace, that's what neoliberalism is. The marketplace dictates to society what's going to happen. Basically, it is. Basically, it's the marketplace over human rights and human needs. That's what neoliberalism is. And since Gough Whitlam's basically was dismissed with the help of the CIA, and they've admitted it, neoliberalism has become a cancer all over the world, and it's a cancer in Australia. And if you notice, we used to have free healthcare, and now it's gradually being whittled away, white-anted away. And they won't be happy until we are in the same sort of dreadful situation that the United States is in, where they can't, most of the people over there cannot afford the premiums of health insurance. So, and even when they have health insurance, they can't really utilize it. And there's a lot of people that aren't insured at all and just don't go to the doctor, and then they just either drop dead or get some sort of dreadful disease. This is the sort of thing that we will end up like if we continue with these allowing neoliberalism and these kind of the sort of governments we have right now. Labor and the Liberals, the coalition, are pretty much the same. They are more interested in corporations than they are in the welfare of humans. They pretend, like Labor pretends they're interested, but they're not really. And you only have to see this stupid marriage, this stupid postal vote on marriage equality, which both Labor and the coalition have been dragging their feet. How embarrassing. There are countries around the world that have got marriage equality, and like even in a very right-wing fundamentalist sort of, there's a lot of fundamentalist Christians in the United States, and even in that country there's states that have marriage equality. Uruguay has marriage equality. There are so many countries that have it, and here we are in 2017, the 21st century, and Australia, this is where Australia is. I never thought, I'm 57 years old, I never thought when I was young that Australia would end up like this. So backward. And I mean, it's not, the leaders they're not representing the people, because most Australians are fine with marriage equality. And let's face it, it's not about marriage equality, it's not about marriage. What this is, this postal vote, I'm getting off the track here about war, but I just want to say this anyway. This is a referendum on whether homosexuals are moral persons. They can't even be honest about what this is. That all the Christian lobby, Christian in quotes, there's nothing Christian about them, all these, homophobes that belong in the last century, a small few, with their poison and toxic hatred that are going to end up causing the suicides of young LGBTIQ children with this toxic hate speech that they're going to be doing for the next couple of months. So this is, a really unfortunate direction Australia has gone since basically Gough Whitlam was dismissed, and it's been neoliberalism, and it's been, other unfortunate factors, and I'm very, very saddened this is how Australia has gone. I'm going to get back now to this war about Iraq, the Iraq War, and the other immoral wars that are happening in the name of so-called humanitarian rights, or ISIS, or whatever invented, sort of excuse the US has for invading countries. I mean, they've been meddling in Venezuela recently, and they've been trying to basically take over Latin American countries for decades, and the CIA has been meddling in those countries for a very long time now, and they're doing their best to try and destroy Venezuela. And you should look into that if you want to find out what's happening in Venezuela. Go and have a look at Telesur, Telesur, which is a Latin American news source, which they're trying to shut down because it's actually fairly independent and actually gives you the real story. So have a look and see what's happening with Venezuela. So, I don't know about you, but I marched against the Iraq War in 2003. And there was a lot of people. I marched in Sydney, and there was a lot of people participated in that. And what happened? We went ahead and did it anyway. What does that say about our government? What does that say about the government in Australia? That they don't care, they couldn't care less what Australian people think about these wars. And that's been demonstrated to me when I ring up these various politicians. They don't care less what you have to say about it. They're just going to do what they're going to do. And I don't know why people keep voting for them. I really don't know why people keep voting for Labor and Liberal coalition when they have absolutely no interest in what you or I have to say about these wars or about Medicare. Healthcare is a right. It's not a privilege. Education is a right. It's not a privilege. We should be free education. In the 80s, you could go to university for free. I had friends that got a degree, they got it for free. And that's how it should be. In a civilized society, education should be an imperative. And it's not a privilege to have health care, and it's not a privilege to be educated. So the anti-war protests anyway, they're basically being ignored. I don't know what it's going to take. But when that saying, when you make peaceful protests, when you make peaceful protests a problem, violence becomes inevitable, basically. That's probably what's going to eventually happen. I'm definitely for non-violence, but I mean, it's true. If you keep making it, a problem for people to peacefully protest, and if you ignore what people, the people want, then things start to go awry. And we all know what happened at the French Revolution, you know, what happened to the oligarchs in the French Revolution. I'm not for violence, but I mean, I'm just saying what has happened in the past. So anyway, you know, I want to talk a little bit about what Matt Howard, the U.S. veteran, said about what they do, what he witnessed in Iraq. Okay? So he said he saw a bus blown up with women and children lying on the side of the road. You know, it was blown to smithereens, and there were dead women and children laying on the side of the road. And apparently he found out that the bus, that the women were waving white flags out of the bus windows. But he found out later that one of the tank commanders was bored and wanted to shoot something, so he blew up the bus. And that's not an uncommon thing. I want you to know, just like the video that Chelsea Manning showed, you know, and ended up, they were going to put her in prison for 35 years. Thank goodness she was released after, I think, 7. But, you know, that collateral murder that you can find on WikiLeaks, collateral murder, you know, that sort of thing is not something unusual. That happens every day in some way or other. And the same with, you know, if we think that this is some sort of aberration, you know, somebody getting bored and blowing up a bus, no. Apparently, if they went into a town and somebody was shooting at them, and couldn't you blame them? They're occupying the country and destroying it. If some person was shooting at them, they had orders that they could kill everybody. Everybody. So it was like collective punishment. Collective punishment. That's what they do in Iraq. That's what they're doing in Iraq. So he said that, you know, they raid houses regularly. So basically, they raid houses. They and the Iraqis are so used to that, they do it over and over again. The same houses almost every night, and the women. Basically what they do is they kick down the door, they go in, they empty all the contents out of the fridge, they ransack the place looking for so-called rifles or whatever, and then they handcuff, they make the, if there's a man there, they make the man of the household kneel down, and they put a bag over his head, and then they handcuff him, and it's a whole humiliation, and they do that, you know, night after night. They have a few soldiers on the roof, and basically that's what they do. And the women are so used to that now that they actually when they see them doing it to their next door neighbor, they actually open the door so they don't kick down the door. This is what our allies are doing, and this is what we are involved in. The Australian Defence Forces are involved in, right? Terrorizing innocent women and children. Terrorizing them in Iraq. And also he told of a story where he had some food. He had a whole bunch of food on his vehicle, and he was traveling through a town and the children all came, the Iraqi children all came running out they were starving, and they came running up to his vehicle, and he started giving them food. And then his commanding officer, in no uncertain terms, directed him to cease giving out the food to the children. And so basically he took it back to the base, and then he said, "What am I going to do with this food?" And the guy said, "Bury it." You know, this is basically, you know, they're not interested. Not only are they not interested in the civilian population, but they have a contempt for them. Whether they're children or they're women or whatever, they have contempt. And using, as I said, using depleted uranium, they know that it causes cancers and genetic defects. And if you've ever seen some of the children that are born, they have such serious deformities that they cannot live. that is a sort of like an intentional genocide. It's an intentional genocide when a government knows that what they're doing is causing extreme deformities, it's causing bone cancers in children and brain cancers throughout the population using depleted uranium even when they don't have to. So let's think about that. We're actually participating, if you're an Australian citizen, your defence forces with your government and your defence forces are participating in, which is what is probably a genocide, an ongoing genocide in Iraq. And the US is leading these dreadful, appalling atrocities. They're basically, we have to ask ourselves, the US needs containment. Russia doesn't need containment. DPRK doesn't need containment. China doesn't need containment, as John Pilger, the journalist, said. The US needs containment. The US is the greatest terrorist threat and the greatest threat to world peace today. The US is the greatest threat to world peace today, and they've actually, there was even a very, very large survey done, and there were a lot of people agreed that the US is the greatest threat to world peace today. Now that's something that is a very, very unpopular thing to say. People are afraid to say it, but we need to start having that conversation. And this is why I've started doing this program that I do. It's just a live stream on Facebook on Real Progressives. If you want to check it out, it's most Fridays it's actually, if you live in Australia, it's usually Saturday morning at 11:15 a.m. On Real Progressives. That's at Real Progressive, and that's singular. So you can find that on Saturdays at 11:15 a.m. If you live in the United States on the East Coast, it's at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time on Real Progressives. That's most Fridays. I usually give a live notification when it happens, and I've been interviewing independent journalists and about these situations in Iraq, in Yemen, in all the countries where we're currently, occupying, basically. So I invite you to check that out, and I'll leave a link to that particular page if you're on Facebook. But you can find. I'll also leave a link to The Naked Empire, which is the YouTube channel where I post these videos. But I want to read something that Muhammad Ali said in the Vietnam War. And let's think about this, okay? Because you know how I mentioned white supremacy. I just want us to think about this. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would put my prestige in jeopardy and could cause me to lose millions of dollars, which could accrue to me as the champion. But I've said it once and I will say it again. The real enemy of my people is right here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. And that's another example of, he's talking about insurgents, that word insurgents that we bandy about so often as if somebody who's fighting for their, fighting because their country is being occupied and their families are being murdered at wedding parties and funeral processions. Seriously. So, and this is another thing about, I wanted to put a quote out there about white supremacy. The Professor Gerald Horne, and I've told you about him on the Empire Files. He did, there was a recent program where he talks about white supremacy and about throughout the beginning of the US from the American Revolution onwards. And he says at the end of this, he says, when you have a nation built on counter-revolution, built on a falsehood about liberty, equality, and democracy, and you never really come to grips with that, a Donald J. Trump is just a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. People cling to this naive idea of the, quote, founding fathers, end quote, and, quote, framers of the Constitution, end quote. And this document that will live forever, when actually was designed to encode the rights of slave owners and creditors, and it seems to me that as long as you don't come to grips with that, then all kinds of opportunism comes very easily. Because if you can rationalize genocide, and you can rationalize enslavement, you can rationalize anything. So that's a very powerful quote from Gerald Horne, Professor Gerald Horne from the University of Houston, about white supremacy and from the founding fathers on in the US. And I invite you to check out that really amazing program on the Empire Files, which was very recent in the last week or so. So, and we can't, I'm just sort of thinking about, this is another one, this is an interesting quote by Chris Hedges about fascism, but it's Christianized fascism, because he says, Christianized fascism is in many ways more dangerous than just your everyday fascism, because in the United States, Christianized fascism is basically, people are almost like hermetically sealed in a way. They have their church gatherings, their entertainment is all seen through this focus, and so basically tens of millions of people are conditioned to think a certain way, and so Christianized fascism is more dangerous than fascism, and and that's unfortunately part of the driving factor. Is a real problem, really, in the United States. Howard Zinn said in a speech, when you know history, you know that governments lie. As I.F. Stone said, governments lie all the time. Well, not just the American government, it's just in the nature of governments. Well, they have to lie. I mean, governments in general do not represent the people of the societies that they govern. And since they don't represent the people, and since they act against the interest of the people, the only way they can hold power is if they lie to the people. If they told people the truth, they wouldn't last very long. So history can help in understanding deception and being skeptical, and not rushing to embrace whatever the government tells you. Citizens of countries that have engaged in military aggression are often in a state of denial. That's not part of his quote, but I mean, many Australians are in a state of denial about what we've been doing to Indigenous people. It's sort of like there's this, what I say when I say, many Australians don't show any interest in what our government is doing in other countries. We don't, because they're brown people and they're in other countries and they're not Westerners. And that's sort of appalling, really. It really is. Howard Zinn, he's an academic and an author. Unfortunately, he's dead now, but he wrote an amazing book, The People's History of the United States. He said, quote, Einstein said that after World War I, he said, war cannot be humanized. It can only be abolished. War has to be abolished, And I know it's a long shot, I understand that, but you have to, when something's a long shot, it has to be done. You have to start doing it. Just as the ending of slavery in this country in the 1830s was a really long shot, but people stuck at it, and it took 30 years, but slavery was done away with, and we can see this again and again. So we have a job to do. We have lots of things to do. Everything we do is important. Excuse me. Every little thing we do, every picket line we walk on, every letter we write, every act of civil disobedience we engage in, any recruiter that we talk to, any parent that we talk to, any GI that we talk to, any young person that we talk to, anything we do in class, outside of class, everything we do in the direction of a different world is important, even though at the moment they seem futile, because that's how change comes about. Change comes about when millions of people do little things which at certain points in history come together, and then something good and something important happens. So that's Howard Zinn's his quote about the abolition of war, and that's what we need to do. We need to abolish war, and that sounds sort of almost unthinkable at this point in time, but that's what needs to happen, because all war is a crime. And in the end, he said, Howard Zinn said, if the American people really knew history, if they learned history, if the educational institutions did their job, if the press did its job in giving people historical perspective, then a people would understand. When the president gets up before the microphone, says we must go to war for this or for that, for the liberty or for democracy, or because we're in danger and so on, if people had some history behind them, they would know how many times presidents have announced to the nation, we must go to war for this reason or that reason. And that's actually, that's it, something that Howard Zinn said, that all governments lie, and this whole idea we need to go to war is usually for oligarchs. It has nothing to do with we the people. It has nothing to do with us. We're just cannon fodder. And he said about American exceptionalism, but there's the notion of, we are different. We are the great. I mean, sure, there are very great things about America, but that's not what we did to other countries, not what we did to black people, not what we did to Native Americans, not what we did to working people in this country who suffered 12-hour days until they organized and rebelled and rose up. No, we have to be honest with ourselves. This is a very hard thing to do, to be honest with ourselves. I mean, but you're brought up and you say, quote, I pledge allegiance, end quote, et cetera, et cetera. Liberty and justice for all. God bless America. Why us? Why does God bless us? I mean, why is he singling out us for a blessing? Why not? Why not God bless everybody? If indeed but if we were brought up to understand our history, we would know nowhere like other nations, only more so, because we are bigger and we have more guns and more bombs, and therefore are capable of more violence. We can do what other empires were not able to do to such an extent. We are rich, well, not all of us. Some of us are, you see, but no, we have to be honest. Don't people join Alcoholics Anonymous so they can stand up and be honest about themselves? Maybe we ought to have an organization called Imperialists Anonymous, and have the leaders of the country get up there on national television and say, well, it's time, to tell the truth. Time to tell the truth. It would be, I don't expect it to happen, but it would be refreshing. Yes, it would be great if people joined Imperialists Anonymous in the United States. Anyway, excuse me, I'm going to wrap it up here, but I just wanted to talk about the various immoral wars that we are engaged in for hegemony and resources, and we're benefiting in Australia. What the US empire is involving us in, and we don't have any problem with that because we benefit from it. There's a good outcome for us in Australia in some way, we think anyway. But all these awful things that we're doing in other countries are going to come back to visit us. Even in a selfish sense, we should care about what we're doing in other countries, because they never ever stay where they are. Those actions are going to come back to visit us. But we should care about what we're doing in these other countries to brown people, to millions of brown people. We're destroying their homes, their families. We're maiming and killing them and causing birth defects. And for what? For resources and hegemony in the region. It has nothing to do with humanitarian causes, because if it did, we wouldn't be there. So we have to get out of these countries, get out of them, and stop following the US into these insane wars. They are insane. And they've been trying to start wars in Russia and China, trying to start wars in Russia and China. That would be a nuclear catastrophe that would end life on Earth, basically. And this insane empire is trying to start a war with Russia. Have we been paying attention to that in Australia? You really don't hear about it in the news at all. So we have to start paying attention to what our government is doing. And we have to start rebelling. We have to start holding they're public servants, these politicians. They're public servants. They're supposed to be doing what we want them to do. And if we don't care what the United States and our defense forces are doing in these countries, then what are we? What kind of a country are we? What kind of a people are we? So let's start a real anti-war movement in Australia and rebel against these immoral wars. And I invite you to check out a website called worldbeyondwar.org, I think it's called. worldbeyondwar.org, run by David Swanson. And check that out. He talks about abolishing war. In fact, look up the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg, Kellogg, Briand, Briand Pact. Look that up on Wikipedia, I think, or wherever, and see what that says. That's a very interesting read. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. My name's Trish Roberts. My YouTube channel is Faint Signals from Vega, but the actual URL is youtube.com/vegantrove, VEGANTROVE. I'm vegan, and I'm going to talk about veganism on another occasion. It's an ethical position which rejects using animals for food, clothing, entertainment, and other reasons. It's an extension of justice. If we are against racism, against sexism, against heterosexism, etc., we should be against speciesism, because sentient beings, non-human sentient beings, they're sentient, they're not resources. And we're killing and torturing 1 trillion land and aquatic animals every year for trivial reasons of mostly palate pleasure. We don't need animal products to survive. We can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and non-animal sources. So the only reason we can say that we're using and killing all these billions and billions of animals, sentient animals, is because we think they taste good, and that's morally unjustifiable. And it's also destroying the environment. 51% of greenhouse gases are from animal agriculture. So I invite you to check out Cowspiracy. That's the name of a documentary, Cowspiracy, The Sustainability Secret, and see what the devastation of animal agriculture does to the planet. But the most important reason to be vegan is because non-human animals are sentient, and we don't have the right to use them. Anyway, my name's Trish Roberts. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you again. Bye for now.